Hello and welcome to Lecture 1, Chapter 1 from the Contacts book, Gamble and Gamble. So I want to begin asking if you all have any questions about the syllabus. I know that I did an overview for you all, so please let me know if there are things that you are wondering about or something you felt wasn't clear enough. And these can all be posted in the question section in the forum on Blackboard. So there is actually a specific forum for questions, so any of these things can be addressed in that or through email, either one. Any ideas or thoughts about the course content or topics to be discussed after you've looked over the syllabus? If you have any thoughts or comments about what you think might be added in or what you would like to see that we discuss, please let me know about that as well. And please let me know if there are any problems getting the book. I hope that you had no problems. I know you can get them at several of the bookstores around USF and then also on half.com and Amazon. So whatever you are able to do to save the most money, please feel free to do that. And then please let me know if you have questions about any of the assignments. Okay, so normally we would do this in a classroom where we would do this face-to-face, but because we're online, I would like you in your first reflection post, which will also be your attendance verification and your enrollment in the class verification. So by tomorrow, please post in the week 1 posts for your first reflection so that I can count you as a part of the course. Please include your name, your major, where you're originally from, why you chose USF, what career goals you have, and if you don't know those quite yet, I understand. You can change that many times. And then one of your greatest personal achievements. So that can help us kind of get to know each other even if it's remotely. Okay, so the first chapter, Understanding Interpersonal Communications. Very basic overview of what the entire book is going to cover, but some really good information. So we will go through some of the highlights. And I thought that maybe as part of your reflection post or as part of just your overall thoughts about this week and this reading, if you could consider what the best part of Chapter 1 was, or maybe what you learned that you didn't know before. There were quite a few things when I first read this that struck me as something I'd never considered. So you may have had those aha moments, as I like to call them, and thought, oh wow, that's something I've never considered. So those might be things that you'd like to share in the discussion. So the definition of interpersonal communication. Officially, it's making personal contacts, establishing a relationship with another individual to satisfy our social needs and to realize our personal goals. So let's tease that apart a little bit. Making personal contacts. So anytime that we have any interaction with another person, whether it be in a school setting, a work setting, a friendship setting, a family setting, we are making a personal contact, and sometimes that's by choice, sometimes it's by necessity, sometimes it's by default. So we make a personal contact and thereby establishing a relationship. So we can't make a contact without establishing a relationship, even if it's just a relationship in that moment. And that's an interesting concept to consider because we may think someone that we have a very brief conversation with in the store, we have no personal contact or relationship with, but that's not true. We actually did have a temporary relationship and contact, so that's kind of interesting to keep in mind. And it satisfies needs or meets goals. And that kind of honestly makes me think that communication can be a little selfish or selfishly driven because we are trying to satisfy our social needs or realize our personal goals. And one of the things that we will go through in this course is learning how to make sure that it's not just about our end of it, but that it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Okay, so typically we will quantify interpersonal communication as a dyad. And a dyad is an interaction between two people. And that is required for a relationship to exist. Clearly, you can't have an interpersonal communication relationship if you are just by yourself. So now intrapersonal communication, which we will get into later, that is a different story. That does not have to have another person, but we will discuss that later. And then what about groups of 3 or more? So if we quantify interpersonal communication as within a dyad, 2 people, what happens when we add 3 or more people? It becomes a triad or then a group. And so we will discuss those things later as well. Essential elements for interpersonal communication. the kinds of relationships that we create depend on how good we are at interacting with others. So clearly, we need to make sure that we are well versed in communication skills and we practice our communication skills, because if we're establishing relationships every time we communicate, we need to be good at it. That's important. And then, of course, the process is transactional. Again, a pretty unique concept, I think. Each component of the interaction affects every subsequent component. So when we think about a transaction, we think often in terms of money or in terms of, an economic transaction or something like that, business transaction. But that implies that there's a process and that one thing leads to another and things follow after certain things. So if we think about interacting in a communication context, every interaction component along the entire course of the interaction affects every subsequent component. So if you can, take a minute, and you can pause this if you need to, read the interaction on page 11 and just kind of consider that interaction and what you take away from that conversation and how what we've just talked about applies in that situation. Okay, so people. We have the element of people in our communication, and that can range anywhere from impersonal to intimate. And impersonal means that we are interacting based on available information. So that may be someone that we interact with when we buy something at a store, or we have just met someone for the very first time. So our available information is pretty limited. And then, of course, we are going on our judgment, our impression, our opinion, not necessarily on anything that we have to base that on. It's just kind of in the moment assessment. Now, intimate is the other end of the spectrum, which means we have prior knowledge of that person. And I think there's a misnomer or miscommunication with the word intimate, because people usually associate intimate with sexuality. And in all reality, the word intimate just means a very deep or connected relationship. So you can have intimacy with your family members, you can have intimacy with your friends. That does not imply a sexual connotation. And so that's something that we will discuss a lot, because we need to kind of break ourselves out of the thought that intimacy is equal to sexuality. And so when we're dealing with people in our communication, each person is both a sender and a receiver in the message, with the message in the interaction. So each person sends messages and receives messages, and those can be simultaneously, they can be reciprocally. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Now, the message is what we're sending back and forth. So if we are sending and receiving, well, what are we doing? We're sending the message. Interestingly, everything that we do, it's not just what we say. Every element of the communication interaction is a potential message. And we will get into nonverbal communication and all of those interesting components of that interaction. But we need to be very aware it's not just our words that people get sent, back and forth. And then the channels are how we send and receive. So we have our people, someone we're interacting with, or multiple people we're interacting with. We're sending the message, and the channels are how we are sending the messages. So then there's the element of noise. And noise just basically is an interference in sending and receiving messages. So if you want to jot this down, or if you just want to kind of brainstorm, what do you think are some examples of what noise might be in a conversation? And you need to kind of think outside of just a sound, but what would be interfering if we are sending and receiving messages and having a difficult time, because it's a lot more than just sounds or something that distracts us. So consider that. That might be something that you want to post about, or that might be something that you kind of monitor as we go through the semester in your presentation or something like that. And then feedback, information we receive in exchange for our messages. So we are sending messages, like I said, and then we get feedback based on what we send out. So we either get clarification that the message was received as intended. So I wanted to communicate that I'm very happy to see you. And you say, oh, I'm so happy to see you as well. Well, clearly that means you understood what I was trying to say. But what's interesting is sometimes we get clarification that the message was received not as we intended. And that can be where the miscommunication comes in, or we think we've effectively communicated and then the response is not what we anticipated at all. So then we kind of have to reevaluate, what did we miss in the sending of our message? And that can be positive or negative. So it can be, yes, the feedback is very good, we are connecting well, we're understanding well, we're communicating well. It could also be negative, where we're kind of surprised at the response that we get. It can be internal or external. So if our feedback is internal, we within ourselves recognize, yes, I'm communicating this appropriately and they are understanding me appropriately. But then externally, the other person can actually be giving us feedback where we are learning from them what's happening. It can be immediate. So right in the moment, we communicate a message, and right at that second, we are confirmed or question whether or not the message was received. Or it can be delayed, where that's kind of where that idea comes of people that you think everything is fine in the relationship, and all of a sudden it explodes into this big fight, and you think, oh my gosh, where did this come from? And you find out that a week or a month or however long ago X, Y, or Z happened, and you said this and whatever, and you're really kind of caught off guard by the fact that, oh my gosh, I didn't anticipate this at all. I thought that the message was clearly communicated and I didn't think we had problems. So there can be that delay, which actually is a challenge for communication, because how do you make sure your message is being sent if you're not aware that it wasn't being sent effectively? So that's something that, when you're upfront and honest in your relationships, that can be very helpful to prevent that. So the context then is the setting in which communication occurs. It can be a physical setting. So I am in a classroom and I'm interacting with a fellow student. That's a physical setting. A social setting can be based on your status or your role. So a husband and a wife have an interaction or a communication relationship, or a professor and a student, those are status relationships. And so depending on the social setting, we interact differently based on norms and expectations and those types of things. There are psychological settings, how you feel about the other person. If you're very intimidated by someone, your context changes versus someone you're very comfortable with, very intimate with. Clearly you're going to have a different approach and a different communication style depending on your comfort level and your like or dislike for the person, etc. The temporal setting, which basically means the history between you and the other person. So do you have previous communication efforts that have impacted the current one? So if you've never had any interaction with someone before, you have no history, so the temporal setting really isn't as relevant. But if you've had many interactions that have been strained or difficult or really great, it's obviously going to play into your current communication situation. And then of course the cultural context. You have rules of communication based on the culture and what is socially and culturally acceptable. And we'll talk a lot about that further into the semester, but it's very important to be aware, just because you come from a certain cultural or framework perspective, that's not necessarily the same with the person you're communicating. And so you have to be kind of gentle and aware of the rules of communication to make sure that you're communicating most effectively. And then the effect. How are you influenced by the exchange? So we often say that everything that we do changes us. It's something that you can't ever get back. It's something that you can't redo. It's something that you can't forget. So how are you influenced by that communication? It could be something you never think of again, but you were influenced in the moment. It could be something that affects you the rest of your life. If you get a phone call and someone tells you that someone you love dearly has passed away unexpectedly, you will be forever influenced by that phone call. You may give someone your change at 7-Eleven and they say, have a nice day, and you say, you too, and you never consider that interaction again, but you were influenced in that moment. So the effect is crucial, because the effect can have a big impact on your memories and your awareness of that interaction. So now that you kind of have a framework of all of the components of interpersonal communication, I'd like you to consider a few things.